The House Oversight Committee room was packed, reporters lining the walls, interns clutching notepads, aides whispering updates as the clock hit 10 a.m. You could feel it in the air. Today was going to explode. Marjorie Taylor Greene was already pacing behind her microphone, her heels clicking across the marble floor. She didn't wait for the chair to officially recognize her. She leaned forward, voice raised just enough to cut through the din. "You want to lecture this body about accountability," she barked, her finger jabbing the air, "when you can't even admit your side's addiction to corruption, to socialism, to weaponizing race to dodge responsibility." The cameras shifted in a clattering wave, zooming in on the smirk she flashed toward Jasmine Crockett. It was the same look she'd worn in a dozen viral clips, equal parts disdain and glee. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't even blink. She just folded her hands neatly over a thick binder stuffed with documentation and waited for Marjorie to finish her rant. "Oh, I know your game," Marjorie continued, her voice now a shrill staccato. "You sit there with your prepared statements and your fancy files and pretend you have some moral high ground. But you're nothing but a talking head for the radical left." A murmur rolled through the chamber. Even some of the Republicans looked down at their papers, uncomfortable with the tone. Jasmine raised her eyes, just slightly, and fixed Marjorie with a stare so calm it was unsettling. A stare that said, "I've been here before. And you're not special." When Marjorie finally stopped for breath, a brittle silence fell. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the ticking of a watch in the second row. Jasmine slowly unclicked her binder, drew out a stack of highlighted reports, and placed them one by one on the table. Her voice was quiet, almost too quiet. Which made it impossible not to listen. "You done?" she asked. Not loud. Not mocking. Just certain. Marjorie opened her mouth, only to realize she didn't have a comeback ready. Jasmine continued, her tone measured but edged with something electric. "You stand here screaming about socialism, corruption, and race like those words are some kind of spell to distract people. But they don't work on me. And they don't work on the millions of Americans watching this who are tired of your theatrics." One of the journalists up front whispered, "She's going in." And she was. Jasmine tapped the stack of reports. "These are receipts," she said evenly. "Documentation of the no-bid contracts, the sweetheart deals you defended, the PAC donations you forgot to disclose. So before you start wailing about everyone else's integrity, maybe take a long look in this mirror." Marjorie's face flushed pink. The room wasn't breathing. Because everyone knew Jasmine Crockett had just turned a shout into a showdown, and she was just warming up. Marjorie didn't sit down. She gripped the microphone, her knuckles white, and tried to laugh it off, a brittle, forced sound that fell flat in the cavernous hearing room. "Oh, spare me the melodrama," she snapped. "You think your binder full of cherry-picked papers proves anything? This is nothing but another performative stunt by someone who's made a career out of playing the victim." Jasmine tilted her head, the smallest smile flickering across her face, not amused, not condescending, but almost sad. Like she pitied how predictable Marjorie had become. "You know what's funny?" Jasmine said softly, voice carrying clear to the back row without needing to rise. "I don't need to play the victim. You and people like you already make sure there are enough real ones." Marjorie bristled, her mouth opening to fire back, but Jasmine held up a hand. The gesture was gentle but final. A hush rippled over the audience, a gravitational pull nobody could resist. "You talk about performative stunts," Jasmine went on, her eyes never leaving Marjorie's, "but here's the difference. When I stand up here, I bring evidence. When you stand up here, you bring volume. That's all you have, noise." She laid her palm flat on the table, over the documents. "These aren't cherry-picked," she continued. "These are audited reports, signed affidavits, and public records. Do you deny they exist?" Marjorie's lips pressed into a line. "Because if you do," Jasmine added, her voice silk over steel, I'd be more than happy to submit them to the record and let America read every word." A collective intake of breath shivered through the chamber. The journalists were scribbling so fast you could hear the pen scratching. For a moment, Marjorie looked smaller, like the reality of being confronted by someone who refused to flinch was finally sinking in. But then she squared her shoulders, reached for her notes, and tried to claw back the narrative. "You're trying to deflect," she hissed. "Because your side can't own up to." "My side?" Jasmine cut in, still calm. "My side is the side of transparency. My side is the side of facts. And facts don't care if they make you uncomfortable." Marjorie swallowed. Her gaze flicked toward the cameras, searching for a sympathetic lens. But the lens was impartial, capturing the way she couldn't meet Jasmine's eyes. Jasmine leaned forward just slightly, lowering her voice so the room had to lean in to catch it. "I'm not here to shout over you," she said. "I'm here to show the country what it looks like when someone stops letting bullies define the story." Then she sat back. Quiet. Steady. It was the quiet that rattled Marjorie the most, because everyone could see who really looked powerful in that silence. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of noise, a wordless indictment neither side could escape. Marjorie shifted in her seat, fingers drumming the edge of the table. For once, she didn't seem to know if she should shout or retreat. Jasmine didn't give her the chance to decide. She lifted the next document, holding it between two fingers like an exhibit in court. "This," she began, her tone even, "is an itemized report detailing your public endorsements of organizations that have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars promoting conspiracy theories. Shall I read them out loud?" Marjorie's jaw clenched. A cameraman panned in tight, capturing every flicker of panic crossing her face. She tried to hide it with a smirk. "Go ahead," she spat, voice brittle. "Let's see if you can twist it the way you twist everything else." Jasmine didn't blink. She began reading, her voice a measured cadence that made each line sound even more damning. June 2021, appearance on a podcast that promoted election denial and threatened public officials. August 2022, fundraising dinner hosted by a group that called for political violence. January 2023, public statement endorsing an organization that labeled the free press the enemy. She paused, letting the last phrase echo. Marjorie's face had gone a shade paler. One of her aides stepped forward, whispering something urgent, but she waved them away with a sharp flick of her hand, too proud to retreat. Jasmine lowered the paper. Her eyes met Marjorie's, calm but unflinching. "You've built your career on yelling louder than everyone else," she said quietly, "and you think that's the same as having principles." She shifted in her chair, the leather creaking under her. "It isn't." Somewhere behind the cameras, a cough broke the tension, but only for a heartbeat. Because Jasmine wasn't done. She lifted her chin and spoke not just to Marjorie but to the entire room. "People at home are watching this," she said. "They're wondering if there's anyone in this building who cares more about truth than about trending clips. They're wondering if integrity is still possible in public service." Marjorie opened her mouth to respond, but Jasmine's next words cut her off, soft but undeniable. "I'm not here for the likes," Jasmine continued. "I'm here because every single time you call accountability an attack, you make it harder for good people to trust any of us." She tapped the reports once, the sound crisp in the hush. "You can keep screaming. You can keep pointing fingers. But the receipts are here. And the facts are here. And the country is watching." Then she folded her hands neatly, as if she'd just concluded a simple briefing. But nothing about the moment was simple, and everyone in the room knew it. Marjorie swallowed hard, her bravado thinning. Because for the first time, she seemed to realize this wasn't going to be one of her victories. This was Jasmine's terrain now, and she was just getting started. Marjorie's lips parted, but no sound came out. The microphones waited, hungry for any scrap of defiance, any desperate quip to salvage her pride. But she hesitated too long. That moment, those 3 seconds of exposed uncertainty, became the most telling statement she could have made. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply turned another page in her binder, the calmness in her hands a quiet demonstration that this was never about spectacle. It was about proof. "You want to talk about twisting facts?" Jasmine said, her tone measured as she flipped to a tabbed section labeled Community Impact. "Let's talk about what happens when you trade honesty for outrage." She held up a printed image, a screenshot of a GoFundMe page. The photo showed a single mother standing beside a rusted-out trailer, her 3 children in front of her, all of them smiling because they didn't know how dire their situation really was. "This woman is from my district," Jasmine continued, voice low but steady. "After your last televised rant about government handouts, she lost her rental assistance. 3 weeks later, her kids were sleeping in the back seat of her car." Marjorie shifted, jaw tightening. But the crowd wasn't looking at her anymore, they were staring at the photo, at the raw humanity of it. "You call that accountability?" Jasmine asked, her eyes locking onto Marjorie's. "You call it leadership to stand on a stage and declare entire communities worthless because it scores you cheap applause?" The room was so quiet you could hear a reporter's pen roll across the table. Marjorie tried to recover, her voice catching as she finally found words. "You can't blame me for—" "I'm not blaming you for poverty," Jasmine cut in, calm as glass. "I'm holding you responsible for exploiting it." She set the photo down with a softness that made the accusation land even harder. "You didn't create every problem we face. But you profit from making them worse." A flicker of movement in the back drew Jasmine's eye, one of Marjorie's aides, tapping frantic notes into a phone. Probably drafting a statement that would spin this as just another attack by the radical left. Jasmine almost felt sorry for them. Almost. She drew a slow breath. Her voice dropped to something close to intimate. "I came here today prepared to argue policy," she said. "But you didn't come to debate ideas. You came to perform." Her gaze swept across the chamber, past the cameras, out to the millions she knew were watching. "And you forgot something," she added. "When you build your power on a lie, all it takes is one moment of truth to make the whole thing collapse." Marjorie swallowed again, her hand gripping the mic as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the room. Jasmine didn't relent. "So go ahead," she said softly. "Call me a socialist. Call me angry. Call me whatever you need to make yourself feel untouchable. But understand this." Her eyes locked on Marjorie's, clear and unwavering. "I will keep showing up with evidence. I will keep showing up for the people you pretend don't exist. And I will keep standing here until the truth is louder than your outrage." A collective shiver ran through the gallery. Even Marjorie's own supporters looked uneasy. Because the cameras didn't just capture a fight. They captured the moment Jasmine made it clear, this was a battle Marjorie was never going to win. Marjorie tried to straighten her shoulders, tried to summon that trademark sneer she wore like armor. But there was no conviction behind it. Because for the first time in a very long time, she realized that someone wasn't going to back down or flinch. Jasmine closed the binder, slow and deliberate. She set her palms flat on the table and let the weight of her gaze settle over everyone in the hearing room. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than before, but somehow it carried twice as far. "Let me tell you something about the people you call the problem," she began. "They're not statistics you can manipulate to fit a headline. They're not props in a speech you can forget once the cameras are off." She gestured to the empty seat beside her, reserved for a community advocate who'd been invited to testify but had been bumped off the agenda when Marjorie demanded extra time for her remarks. "That chair was supposed to be filled by a woman named Elena," Jasmine said. "A social worker who spends 16 hours a day helping families recover from evictions you keep justifying. A ripple of discomfort moved through the committee. Jasmine continued, steady and unhurried. Elena doesn't have a pack behind her. She doesn't have a primetime slot on cable news. All she has is her story, and today, you decided it wasn't worth hearing. Marjorie shifted again, her hand trembling just slightly as she reached for her water. She didn't look up. So I'll tell it for her, Jasmine said. She lifted a folded sheet of paper, her thumb smoothing the crease before she read. 3 years ago, Elena lost her sister to an asthma attack in a mold-ridden apartment she couldn't afford to leave. She spent her grief fighting for housing reform, working to pass the exact legislation you called a waste of taxpayer dollars. A hush fell so thick that even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. You call that waste? Jasmine asked. Because where I come from, we call it humanity. A beat passed. Then she leaned forward, voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. You know what I think, Congresswoman? I think deep down, you're terrified that if enough people hear stories like Elena's, they'll stop buying what you're selling. Marjorie's lips parted, but Jasmine kept going before she could respond. You're afraid they'll realize you've never cared about fixing anything, only about blaming someone. Anyone. As long as it distracts from your failure to lead. She let that land. In the silence, Jasmine's voice felt impossibly steady. I came here to remind you that you don't own the narrative, she said. And you don't get to silence every voice that challenges you. Marjorie finally looked up, her eyes glassy. But Jasmine didn't flinch or soften. Because today, she concluded, her words crisp as a verdict, America heard you. And they heard me. And between the two of us, only one of us came with receipts. A low, stunned exhale rippled across the room. The headlines were already writing themselves. And Jasmine didn't need to say another word, because the truth was louder than any accusation Marjorie could muster. For a full 10 seconds, Marjorie Taylor Greene didn't speak. She just stared at Jasmine across the table, her expression a swirl of resentment and something she'd never admit, fear. Fear that the performance she'd counted on, rage as a shield, derision as a weapon, wasn't working this time. Jasmine didn't look triumphant. She didn't smirk or roll her eyes. She simply sat there, composed, as if she had all day to wait for Marjorie to find her courage. Finally, Marjorie managed a brittle laugh. You think you're so righteous, she said, voice thin. But you're just another politician, hiding behind sob stories because you can't defend your policies. Jasmine tilted her head. You call them sob stories. I call them reality. And unlike you, I don't get to walk away from it when the cameras stop rolling. A murmur ran along the rows of journalists. The phrase sob stories was going to be the pull quote. It would headline the next hour's news cycle, whether Marjorie liked it or not. Marjorie's face tightened as she realized her mistake. She reached for her prepared notes, a stack of talking points she'd rehearsed until her voice went hoarse. But suddenly, the slogans felt small in her hands. Here's the difference between us, Jasmine continued, her tone like the calm before a thunderclap. I'm not afraid of these stories. I don't flinch from them, because I understand they're the cost of leadership. She paused, her gaze sweeping the committee members, the aides, the rows of press. What I won't do is pretend poverty and pain are character flaws to be mocked or erased. I won't pretend systemic failures are the fault of the people living through them. Marjorie opened her mouth, but Jasmine was already pressing forward. You spend so much time trying to convince America that compassion is weakness, Jasmine said. But I'll tell you what weakness really looks like. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, precise note that made every camera inch closer. Weakness is refusing to listen. Weakness is being so desperate for applause that you trade away your conscience. Weakness is thinking you can shout over facts forever, and never be held accountable. A hush settled over the room. The chair of the committee shifted uncomfortably but didn't dare interrupt. Jasmine picked up her binder again, but this time she didn't open it. She tapped her palm on the cover. "I brought evidence because I knew you'd try to deny reality," she said. "I prepared because I respect the people who sent me here, and I respect the truth." She let the final words hang in the air like the aftermath of a storm. "But you," Jasmine finished quietly, "you didn't come prepared for any of this. Because you thought bluster would be enough." Marjorie swallowed, her hand tightening around her pen. And in that moment, the entire chamber could feel the truth settling like dust. This wasn't just another spectacle. This was a reckoning, and Marjorie Taylor Greene had never been more unprepared. Jasmine let the stillness stretch. She knew the silence could say more than any monologue, and in that instant, everyone in the room could feel it. Marjorie finally shifted her gaze to her own staff seated behind her, as if hoping for some cue or lifeline. But none came. Even they were looking down at their notepads, avoiding her eyes. Jasmine straightened her stack of documents, methodical, unhurried. Then she looked up and spoke in the same clear voice that had already cracked the facade Marjorie had spent years perfecting. "You want to talk about policy failures?" she asked. "Fine. Let's talk." She picked up a sheet and read aloud, her tone precise. "In 2022, you voted against funding for school meal programs that would have fed over 800,000 children. Children whose parents work 2 or 3 jobs but still can't cover rent and groceries in the same month." She dropped the paper onto the table. The sound was soft but final. "In 2023, you went on television and called those same parents entitled," Jasmine continued. "And last year, when the cameras were off, you laughed about it. Like it was a punchline." A flicker of heat flushed across Marjorie's cheeks. Jasmine's voice dropped lower. "I know you think if you say it with enough confidence, it won't matter. That people will forget. But here's the truth." She leaned forward just enough that Marjorie's shoulders stiffened. "I didn't come here to make you comfortable. I came here to make you honest." A reporter near the back whispered, "God, she's dismantling her." Marjorie swallowed and tried to rally. "You don't know what I've done for this country," she shot back, her voice sharp, desperate. Jasmine's reply was almost gentle. "You're right. I don't know everything. But I know this: you can't call yourself a servant of the people and treat them like burdens." She looked around the committee chamber, locking eyes with each member. "And you can't call yourself a patriot when you only fight for the Americans who already agree with you." No one spoke. The air itself seemed to press down on the tables. Jasmine let that weight linger. Then she gathered her notes and stood, smooth and unhurried, her gaze never wavering from Marjorie's. "You don't have to respect me," she said quietly. "But you will respect the truth." And in that moment, before any statement could be released, before any spin could be drafted, the room felt like the only honest place in Washington. Marjorie tried to respond, but her voice came out thin, almost brittle. "This is all politics," she managed. "You're just here to make a scene." Jasmine didn't blink. "If you think telling the truth is a scene," she replied, "that says more about your conscience than it does about my motives." She turned to the chairperson. "Madam Chair, I'd like to enter these documents into the record." The chair nodded, almost relieved to have something procedural to do. "Without objection." But Jasmine didn't sit back down. She rested her fingertips on the edge of the table, steadying her voice for what came next. "When I was 12, she began, I watched my mother get a letter from the landlord. Rent was going up, again. She worked nights cleaning offices, but no matter how many hours she took, it never felt like enough. That was the first time I understood what it means to be humiliated for being poor." She paused. Everyone was listening now. Even Marjorie, who looked as if she'd rather be anywhere else. "I remember her crying in the kitchen," Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. "And I remember thinking, one day, I'm going to sit in a room with people who can change this." She took a breath, steady but fierce. And here I am. And here you are. The chamber was so quiet it felt like the world outside had stopped. You call it politics, she said. I call it accountability. Marjorie's jaw tightened. You're weaponizing your past to make me look like the villain. Jasmine tilted her head. I'm not making you look like anything. You did that yourself when you decided some Americans were worth fighting for and the rest were worth mocking. A murmur rippled through the rows of reporters. The camera lights brightened, capturing every micro-expression on Marjorie's face. This is why people don't trust Washington, Jasmine said, her tone clear and quiet. Because too many leaders think they can build careers on outrage and fear, and never get called out for the harm it does. Her gaze swept the room, landing back on Marjorie. I'm not here for applause. I'm not here for a viral clip. I'm here because my constituents deserve someone who won't flinch when the powerful try to shout them down. Marjorie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The fight had drained out of her posture, leaving something smaller behind, resentment, maybe, but also a dawning recognition that she'd underestimated the woman sitting across from her. Jasmine gathered her papers, each movement deliberate. She paused, then looked up one last time. And if telling the truth makes you uncomfortable, she said, her voice soft but unbreakable, that's not my problem. That's your reckoning. She sat down, calm as a closing door. The chairwoman cleared her throat, trying to reclaim the rhythm of the session. Thank you, Representative Crockett. Ms. Greene, do you have any closing remarks? Marjorie hesitated. The fire in her eyes was dimmer now, replaced by a glassy sheen that made her look almost lost. She glanced at her aides, hoping for a cue, but they were busy scribbling notes they'd later turn into damage control. Finally, she lifted her chin. I believe in this country, she said, voice thin. And I will not apologize for standing up for my values. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She just watched, calm, unblinking, the way a teacher might watch a student recite a lesson they didn't understand. Marjorie continued, and I will not be bullied by someone who thinks their personal story gives them the right to shame me. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. You're not being shamed, she said evenly. You're being shown. A stunned silence. Shown what happens when you confuse cruelty for conviction, she added. The sentence landed like a gavel. One of the younger reporters in the back pressed his palm to his chest, mouthing, wow. Marjorie tried to gather her composure, but the edges of her voice frayed. You think you're better than everyone else in here, don't you? No, Jasmine replied. I think the people who sent me here deserve better than everyone else in here pretending. She didn't say it to score a point. She said it because it was the only answer that was true. The chairwoman cleared her throat again, a hint of respect in her eyes now. We'll enter the remainder of Representative Crockett's materials into the record. She tapped her gavel, but no one moved. It was as if everyone needed a moment to process what they'd just witnessed. Marjorie finally stood, her jaw tight. But when she turned to gather her papers, her hands shook so visibly that one of her aides stepped forward to help. Jasmine stayed seated. She looked at Marjorie and spoke softly, almost as if offering her a last chance at dignity. You have every right to your beliefs, she said. But don't confuse volume with virtue. Just because you can shout doesn't mean you're right. Marjorie didn't answer. She tucked her folders under her arm and walked out without looking back. For a few seconds, the hearing room was completely still. Then a reporter near the aisle whispered, "That was history." And it was. Not because Jasmine had humiliated anyone, but because she'd told the truth in a place that usually survives on half measures and deflection. The cameras panned to Jasmine one last time. She sat there, calm, as if she hadn't just shifted the air in the entire building. When Jasmine finally stood, the hush in the room didn't lift, it thickened. Like everyone was holding their breath, afraid to be the first to break the spell. She gathered her binder, her notes, the stack of records she'd entered into the hearing. She moved with the kind of calm that doesn't come from arrogance, but from knowing you did exactly what you came to do. One of Marjorie's aides tried to slip past her in the aisle, avoiding eye contact. Jasmine paused just long enough for the young man to look up. Then she nodded, slow, respectful. He swallowed and nodded back. Even in disagreement, she didn't pretend her opponents were invisible. As she reached the door, a reporter raised her voice, almost trembling. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you have any final comment on Representative Greene's remarks?" Jasmine turned back, her silhouette framed in the doorway. She didn't raise her chin or set her jaw like she was posing for a headline. She just looked tired in the way only someone who's carried a truth too long can be. "My final comment," she said, her voice level and unhurried, "is that this country has had centuries to decide whether it wants to be ruled by fear or by facts." She glanced at the rows of journalists, their recorders held out like small shields. "And every time someone like Ms. Greene tries to shame others for having the nerve to survive hardship, I remember exactly why I ran for office." Someone tried to interrupt with another question, but Jasmine held up her hand. "No more spin," she said gently. "No more excuses. The facts are on the record. The character was on display." She paused one last time, letting the moment sink in. Let the American people decide which matters more. Then she stepped through the doorway, and the hush finally cracked apart into 100 frantic whispers. In the hallway, her staff fell in beside her. Devon, her communications director, looked both exhilarated and exhausted. "You realize you just guaranteed this will be the lead story on every network for the next week," he murmured. Jasmine exhaled, steady. "Good. Maybe people will finally stop pretending they don't see what's right in front of them." They walked together toward the elevator, passing aides who tried to look busy and senators who pretended not to watch her go. When the elevator doors slid open, Jasmine turned to Devon. "Let's get to work on the housing amendment. They're going to accuse us of grandstanding anyway. We might as well keep moving." Devon smiled, even though his eyes were tired. "On it." And as the doors closed, sealing them off from the chaos outside, Jasmine felt something she hadn't felt all day, a flicker of quiet satisfaction. Not because she'd won a soundbite, but because she'd told the truth. And she hadn't flinched. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last word. Because what you just witnessed wasn't just a political clash or another viral headline, it was a reminder that speaking truth to power isn't about theatrics. It's about courage. Jasmine Crockett didn't have to scream to be heard. She didn't need to twist the facts or hide behind rehearsed outrage. She simply stood her ground and refused to let the loudest voice in the room be mistaken for the most honest one. And maybe that's the lesson we all need right now, that integrity can be quiet, that conviction doesn't always come with applause, and that sometimes the most radical act is refusing to shrink. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, share it. Talk about it. Remember it. Because this isn't just about one hearing or one headline. This is about who we are when the cameras are rolling, and who we choose to be when they're not.